Hey there YouTube, how's it going? Nerdy Narwhal here, and I'm back again today for part 2 of my Orc Combat Patrol painting tutorial, kind of. I suppose that's what this is. Now let's hop in and finish up this Combat Patrol. Now, when last we left off, we had just begun the slap chop portion of this painting video. And that is exactly where we are going to pick back up again. So I have my speed paints out back there, ready to rock and roll, and we are just going to get to it. This first one that I'm using here, this Briar Queen Ice, or what is it? Briar Queen Chill. I like to use on the denim pants after I've done a little zenithal layer, and it makes them look decently enough like a pair of denim. I don't know. I'm an American. I know that orcs aren't, they're based on Brits, but I feel like orcs represent your working class man fairly well enough. And you know what? In my country, the pants of the working class man are denim. And so that's what a number of these boys are going to get here. Now I'm still color blocking well enough during this step, although you don't need to be super duper careful as you did with some of those earlier layers if you even wanted to do this sort of quick painting step here. Those first layers you didn't need to be comfortable or careful with at all if you weren't going to use any slap chop methods in your paint. However, these are contrast paints, which means they go on pretty easy and they leave somewhat of a translucent layer. So if you do mess up a little bit, that's okay if you get out of the lines, because you'll be able to cover it up easily enough later on. Now, not all orcs, or not all of my orcs, I guess, are going to wear denim pants. Some of them are going to have brown pants. And in order to slap chop the brown pants on, we are going to use some of this brown Gilliman flesh, which I also substitute often enough for just a nice brown wash. But here, they are going to be the pants of some of these orc boys. Now, if I recall correctly, a lot of the clothes that these guys wear, and a lot of what their cloaks are made out of, is actually squig hide. So for that, we are going to go back to the wet palette and get some of the squig skin tone that we used to slap on some of these boys. Just kidding. Can you imagine how long this would take if I did the whole thing in slow-mo? That'd be miserable. Now, this step for me is a little bit more shotgun approach. What I'm gonna do here, and what I have been doing, is pick up a mini and use the color that I have on my palette that I want to use. Maybe that's one of my contrast paints. Maybe that's one of, well, right now it's the squig blend that I have on my wet palette, right? And I'm just going to try to paint every piece of that model that I want done in that color. And eventually, as time progresses, all of these models are going to be more or less completely filled in with colors, doing it that way. There's no plan really in place for what mini to do next. This is just the step that I'm on. So keep on trucking away at this, just like this, until you've used up your palette and your minis have not really any blank spots left on them. Now I am going to introduce here to my palette some Wraithbone, as well as some bold titanium white from Pro Acryl to add to it, to mix it up, to get some gradient, some bone up to a lighter colored bone. And that's because these guys have a whole lot of bits on them, especially our boss man here, which are going to require some bone. So I'm just going to get that wetted up and ready to go, so that as I'm going through here and adding my splotches and sploots of color to these guys, I can also hit some of those bone pieces if I feel so inclined. right, now all of these guys have at least one layer of contrast tossed over their pauldrons. So the next step is going to be some detail work. All of these boys have eyes, they all have teeth, and I'm going to get out my tiny little brush here so that I can just go in there and do some boops and maybe a couple of swoops to get all those little details popped out. And while I'm doing that, I might hit some of the baubles and trinkets that a few of them have also. Like that tooth hanging from this guy's arm. But first, my paint cups are getting nasty. So I'm gonna go clean those boys out. Right, and that's going to be all of the eyes for these boys. Pretty easy, pretty quick to do. I just went in there for each of them using this little detail brush, and just a quick horizontal swoop is going to give me the effect that I want. Let's see if we can get that to focus or if it's too small. There we go. Just a little red dot. And it's okay if it overbleeds a little tiny bit, because after the wash at the very end, it'll just look like a faint glow. For the squigs, I like to do it opposite. If the orcs are green with red eyes, the squigs, being mostly red, they get little green eyes. And so I went in there for the squigs and did the exact same thing that I did for the boys. Right now, we have picked out almost all of those bone details and all of those teeth in these miniatures, which is going to bring us to the next step, which will be getting all of those leather and black details and going in and getting some of the metallics also. For that, I'm going to add 3 more paints to my palette. First, I have some warm brown from Pro Acryl, some silver from Pro Acryl, and some of this Wine Mom Black, which is just some Walmart brand black paint in some Lamian medium. Pigmentation is great, it takes washes really nicely, and it's just about the perfect consistency in there to where I don't need to even put that on my palette. So I like to lean on that for some of my blacks. I might also go in and lighten some things up with some of that Pro Acryl golden brown as well. Let's get to it. guys are just about ready for that next step here. And I'm just going through and getting some of my last bits of black on there to make sure that they are ready for it. But I did want to take a second to talk about how the palette turned out on this one. Now, I said at the start of the video that I have my orc palette down in a way that I do enjoy, and that does lean a whole lot on this coloring book sort of look. I like my big blues and my reds and my yellows and all of that. So over my Superman colors, right? A comic book. All over my orc boys and their green, and I really like that type of green, and it looks pretty good. Now with these savage orcs, these beast snaggas, I did try to tie everything together with a bit more of an earthy sort of brown look, and I went in there with my brown colors and my brown washes, and I slapped those all over the back, and I think that turned out pretty good. They will stand with the rest of my orc boys and look pretty good, and they'll also stand a little bit uniquely in my army when I field them, especially if I field them with my regular second edition looking boys. You will know that these are the beast snagga orcs. They look a little bit more savage than the rest of the army, and that makes me happy. Accomplished with those browns, those bone colors, and that's pretty darn cool. Excellent. After a few days of coming back and dumping a color onto the wet palette and going through and batch painting all these guys, we are finally ready for the penultimate painting step. And that step is one of my favorites to this entire process of batch painting a combat patrol. Now, perhaps we are due a real quick story time in regards to this final step. I have a buddy who's really into oil washes, and I can't deny that the figures that he's painted and done that oil wash technique on looks really, really great. But it seemed to me like doing them all one at a time would take a little bit too long. I had also just recently finished off an entire can of Army Painter dip and was looking for something to replace that. He sent me a bottle of this oil paint thinner right here. I think it's white spirits in there, as well as some of this Winsor & Newton black and a thing of white oil paints. What I did was smack some black, some brown from an old oil paint that I had lying around some art supplies, some of that oil paint thinner into this jar and shook it up real good, basically giving me the oil paint, I want to say, oil paint equivalent to Nuln oil from Games Workshop. There's a little black, a little tiny bit of brown, some gray tones in there, and it just settles over a mini so nicely. And what I like to do here, pop that lid off, is I just take the miniatures and dunk them in the dip. So all this penultimate step is an oil paint based homemade dip for the minis. Let's see how good they look over these orcs. This whole process has the potential to be extraordinarily messy. So what I've done to prep is I've set all the minis off to the right. I have my dunk, my dip in the middle, and I have the drying plate to the left and a few other drying plates just off camera. I've put all of my brushes away, especially my good brushes, and have only a junk brush left out to wipe away some excess oil if I see fit. I don't actually like to touch the minis either. I like to give them a dunk using this little clippy here, and then I gently set them on the plate. Let's do one together, and then we will do probably a little speed cut. Let's start off big. We will give this knob a dunka. And then over to the drying plate. Let's come in nice and close on them real quick. And you can already see, oh, maybe you can't, there we go. That dip is already giving some complexity to the mini. That's going to be it for all of the minis that would actually fit inside the rim of my dip tank. For the rest of them, all these guys on this last drying plate here, I'm just going to get a large brush and give a very heavy-handed wash. I've not done this often. Let's see how that turns out. Heavy on that wash. You can already tell the oil paints are finding little nooks and crannies and cricks and cracks to get into. I don't want to miss a single spot. There we go. Make sure I get the back. And then, oh, don't miss that. There we go. Just set it aside to dry. And voila, that step is done like that. Now, here's the longest part, probably, the longest step of this painting tutorial, and that is waiting. These guys are going to need at least 24 hours to let that oil paint dry, and that's just where I live. I live in an incredibly dry environment. My layers of paint dry like that. However, where you live, it could be as much as several days that you will need to wait for this to dry. But I'm not going to do this step with idle hands. In fact, I'm going to hop right into it now and go through and inspect every single mini and use a junker brush to wipe away oil in places where I might not want it. Places like eyes, if it's covering up the coloring that I did in the eyes. Places like teeth, right? If it's completely obscuring the look of teeth, we're going to wipe that oil wash away. Okay, give them a swoop. Okay, help that eyeball come out a little bit. Oh, there you are. Good morning. It's been about a full day on these guys, and I'm pleased to say that that oil dip that we did, that wash, is just about completely dried, and I am loving the results. That means that these guys are also finally so close to being ready to be able to be played, oh no, on a tabletop. But there is still a couple of steps that we need to do first before we can do that. We need to base them, and before that, we need to lock in this beautiful oil wash because it is rather fragile. Luckily, I have just the tools for the job, and I have all the time in the world today to do just that. Now, I like to varnish my minis in two parts. The first coating that I like to give them is usually some kind of crystal clear enamel. This particular one by Rust-Oleum works great. It's super thick, super sheen, see-through, right? And it really is going to protect that mini for a long, long time, which is what I want with these oil washes because I don't want that beautiful shading to rub off. It does dry a little bit gloss though. So after this layer completely dries, I like to hit it with some Dull Coat. Big fan of Tester's Dull Coat. I've been using this stuff for years, since before I even started painting minis, back when I was just doodling around on random action figures, giving them blood spatter and whatnot. And this stuff works great. There's tons of other products out there though, tons of stuff that works great, and if you have a preference, I'm not going to say it's wrong. Now, first things first, I'm going to get the drying area ready. Make sure that fan is turned on. I also like to use this little dehumidifier in the bathroom while I'm letting these miniatures dry, because I find that if I take as much moisture out of the air as I possibly can, it's going to speed up the drying time in between those layers of lacquer spray. I've divided all of these miniatures up between 5 plates, which means I'm going to go outside, spray a plate, come back in, set it somewhere in the bathroom, go outside, spray a plate, come back in, do that 5 times. They're all spaced out pretty well. No miniatures are rubbing up against another, which means I should be able to get a good coating over each and every single miniature on this plate. And yes, I'm also going to be spraying those other minis that weren't a part of the Combat Patrol, those extra orcs that I got, a couple of prints in there, and just a couple of extra boys to fill out a unit in a full game of 40K, as opposed to just a Combat Patrol game. Alright, let's get rocking. First things first, we're going to hit it with the Rust-Oleum Crystal Clear enamel. Now I try to stand downwind for this. I think I did it today. There's not much of a breeze, but I can't smell it yet, so that's good. I'm going to give it a generous coating all over. Take that back inside. Okay, it has been about an hour now. These guys are just dry to the touch, which is what we want. They are awful shiny though, which means it's time now to hit them with some of that dull coat. It's been another hour, and I think it's time to check in on these guys. They are dry to the touch, and they are looking awesome. Let's go back over to the crafting table and give an example on how I'm going to base this Combat Patrol. Let's go for one extreme close-up here of how that oil wash did under the light. So you can see that the layering that I did on the boy really pops now, and the squig as well. And what that oil wash did is it went in there, and I guess it sort of helped blend it, right? Like there's that bright green line on the pec there, and from a few feet away it almost just looks like a rippling green muscle poking out under the lighting. I just really like how that oil wash plays with my painting process. I think that looks pretty darn good. What do you think? Now let's talk about my basing process. It's really simple for these little guys right here. For some of the larger, some of the character models, I might bust out a 3D printed dead marine and paint that up and stick that on the base too. However, for the bulk of my army, it's really just this sand right here. And what this is a couple of bags of Hobby Lobby sand of various colors, right? As well as the innards of a 1 pound weight from a weighted training vest. I had a weighted training vest a few years ago, and one of the things broke and outpoured all these little tiny iron balls, which I added to my basing because I thought they looked pretty good. And they did look pretty good. I have that, and I have some tacky glue, which is going to just go all over the base of this boy. Let's see if it's coming out right. Okay. All over the base of this boy, who's going to get a dunk, a little bath in that sand, and then we will call him good. Maybe later on he will get a bog standard black ring around the base, because I do like to do that too. There we go. Just sort of pour it on heavily and let it flow, hopefully, into every nook and cranny around his feet without getting too much on the model itself. all around the feet there. Hold it like this, let it flow a bit. And there. I'm not gonna videotape basing every single model because that's gonna take some time, which I guess we do all have, but once you've seen one, you've pretty much seen them all. I'll wipe off that excess right there, set them in to my sand, and just sort of give them a little rotate, maybe shake the cup around so that the sand goes all over that model. There we go, give it a couple of scoops, let it run down everywhere, and voila. Again, we'll wipe off the excess. And that boy's looking great. And that's how this whole Combat Patrol is gonna end up looking. A couple of quick notes about this process. You might want to make sure that the model is completely dry prior to your giving it a sand bath. If it's not, you will find that the sand loves to stick just about everywhere on the model that it possibly can. It's also a good idea to have a little pick. As you can see right there on the foot, I have some sand spillage, some glue spillage. I'm going to use my pick to get that off the model itself. I just want the sand on the base, not the model. As well, some rub down there on the base to get that bit off that's stuck a bit lower than I had hoped. This process can be a little bit messy. You can see I've already got little bits of sand all over my mat. However, the mat itself is easy to clean, and the end result really punches above its belt, above its weight, in terms of the quality look that it gives. And there you have it, YouTube. That has been how I paint the new Orks Combat Patrol, the Beast Snagga Boys Combat Patrol. That was a really fun little experiment. I've never actually filmed myself painting that much. It definitely made things take a little bit longer. I like that batch painting protocol as I do it because it does help give an entire war band a really uniform look. So I do all the greens, all the other things, all at once, and even when there's variation, it looks intentional and still cohesive enough to be a single unit, as opposed to relying on mixing up the same blends as I did for a unit that I worked on weeks and weeks ago. Now, it does get a little mind-numbing. I think my upper limit for what I enjoy batch painting is going to be about 10 models, somewhere in there. One single unit is good for batch painting. This entire Combat Patrol, which consists of 3-4 units, I think, total if you count the War Boss, that's pushing it a little tiny bit for my batch painting enjoyment. Anyways, though, I appreciate you guys tagging along on this little adventure. The whole thing took me maybe about 2 weeks to bust out. And a disclaimer, I'm not a professional painter. I'm not ever going to be winning a Golden Demon, most likely. I'm not even considering going for it. Obviously, as you can tell by the quality of my paints. I just enjoy the hobbying process. And I'm still fairly new into the hobby. I think this is my 9th month of being into Warhammer and actually painting miniatures and building miniatures. So I still have a whole lot to learn as I refine how I do things. What I am good at, though, is I have a image in my head and colors that I like to use, and making those colors come alive on a model, and I think it turns out pretty well. I think I'm definitely at a point where I can show up to a table with my army and not be scoffed at for the quality of paint. So that's what I'm going for. I want to show up with models that look well painted enough and enjoy a great game of Warhammer. My process is efficient in doing just that. Now, if you have any questions about anything that I've done or need clarification on anything, please hit me up in the comments. I love to get dialogues going, and a couple of folks have already reached out to me and we've gotten a dialogue going, and it's been really rewarding and a fun way to interact with the hobby and the community that I am a part of and enjoy being a part of. Let's end this video off looking at a couple of my favorite models that came out from this Combat Patrol. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Now I've got a lot of boys to finish the basing on. I don't know if I'll get through all of that today. Maybe I'll put these guys in my cabinet and wait for next time. But I appreciate once again you guys joining on in this hobby time journey. Nerdy Narwhal signing out. Stay happy, stay healthy, and keep on collecting. Bye-bye.